ChatGPT Plus is free for college students through May. Here's the thing. You've got a lot to do between now and then. Studying for finals, writing papers, trying to keep your life on track, and ChatGPT can help with all of it. It can quiz you for your econ exam, make a study guide from your French notes, plan out your meals and study breaks. It can get really specific on how you like to learn. It can even help you come up with ways to stop procrastinating. So from now until summer break, take advantage of all the ways ChatGPT can make your life easier. Restrictions apply.
10-year-old girl, 9-year-old girl, 15-year-old girl doesn't need $37.
Hey, 10 or 9 or 15-year-old girls, when you can only have one doll, there's only one doll to have. Tariff Tilly, the perfect companion to help you ride out our magical trade war.
I love playing alone with you. China's eating our lunch.
You'll love playing with Tariff Tilly during off-work hours.
It's 5 a.m. Time for your shift at our onshore lithium factory.
And don't forget to grab Tariff Tilly's hottest new accessory.
Thing that you carry the babies around in.
That's right, Tariff Tilly's thing you carry the babies around in. Now just $7,000. Import Tariff Tilly to your playroom today. Available Christmas 2029.
Quiet Riot. Welcome to Quiet Riot. My name is Andreou. Amid much fanfare, an outline agreement between the UK and the US was announced last week. Only we're not exactly sure if it is a trade deal, or indeed if it's a deal at all. The document says it is not legally binding, but also has a starting date last Thursday. Stories are flying around about hormone beef and digital taxes. Also, apparently, we're buying all the Boeings at the all-you-can-Boeing buffet. As promised on Sunday, I have put all of those questions to someone who actually knows what he is talking about, and he has answered all of them, or at least tried to. I spoke to the director of the UK Trade Policy Project, David Henig, over the weekend. Now, on Monday, the US agreed a pause in the tariffs with China to negotiate. I spoke to David again, and our shared view was that it didn't affect anything that we talked about in any real way. It is a suspension that will almost certainly become permanent, unless, of course, Toddler 47 wakes up tomorrow with acid reflux and posts a declaration of war against Panama on Truth Social. Who knows? Also, on Monday, we got Starmer's immigration reset, which I am choosing to ignore until the full episode on Thursday. Firstly, because I need Naomi there for emotional support, and secondly, because I have a lot to say and I need the full length. Until then, I just have to carry on doing incalculable damage to this country with my squalid foreignness. In the meantime, here is everything you need to know about the UK-US agreement and how it affects the EU summit next Monday. It is a cracker of a conversation. Quiet Riot. Hello, David. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. Always a pleasure.
Now, David, first of all, shall we start with some really basics? Is this a trade deal? There seems to be some confusion even about that.
Well, there isn't actually a formal definition of a trade deal. Sometimes people regard a trade deal as being what's called a full free trade agreement, which is where you agree to substantially liberalise all trade compared to World Trade Organization rates. This clearly isn't that. But many other things are referred to as trade deals as well, of removing minor irritants from a trade relationship, helping to facilitate exports. And I think this deal does qualify in that sense. So that's number one, it probably is a trade deal. But number two is this even a deal? Because some people have noted that the document that was put out by the UK and the US specifically says this is not legally binding. But it also says this document comes into force on 8 May. So it's a little confusing. But I would suggest that our best belief is that elements relating to UK car exports and to the UK importing beef and bioethanol from the US are probably binding, and many other aspects are not at all binding and will be subject to future negotiation. But this is Trump world. We don't know that is definitely the case.
Yes, for what it's worth, that was my guess too, that since tariffs were introduced by executive order anyway, so it's just quite literally the White House deciding to put X amount of tariffs on Y, then that agreement can come into being at will, effectively. It's just one country's leader agreeing with a country's leader that we're going to do this from today. But you're right, there are a lot of things in it that are slightly fluffier and slightly more to be discussed in the future. But I have to say, trade agreements often have that element too. They have things that are fully agreed and things for which a framework for discussing in the future is agreed. Can I ask you, it seems to me that the United States rushed the announcement, that they were a little bit keen. Is that your impression from what you know of this kind of negotiation?
Well, this isn't any kind of normal trade negotiation. And I think it should be pointed out that nothing that Trump has done has been any kind of normal in trade terms, actually most of the rest of what he's done, since he came into office. So clearly it wasn't going to be a normal negotiation. My best guess, for what it's worth, is that earlier in the day or the previous day to the one on which the deal was on the one on which Trump and Starmer discussed this, is that an exporter of bioethanol suddenly got hold of President Trump and said, you could make this deal with the UK and sell them a lot of things. And President Trump suddenly got excited, phoned Keir Starmer and said, this'll be the deal. And the UK said, that sounds good. We'll take that. That is no kind of normal way to do a deal, but it does reflect, I think, that Trump was under pressure to do a deal, and the UK, in a sense, is happy enough to do a deal. Nobody is going to criticize Trump too much in the US for doing a deal with the UK. So for Trump, job done. And I think the wider point here is that President Trump, in many respects, and including trade, thought he could easily shape the world to his image or his way of thinking in the second term. Remember, no handbrakes, no grown-ups in the room, simply Trump able to do exactly what he likes, rule by diktat, no evidence that Congress has any role. So at the start of April, he says, we are going to put tariffs on everyone. He rolls out the formula. He's already said tariffs on steel and cars. And he seems to think that by the end of the month or the end of the week, all industry will have returned to the US and everyone will live happily ever after. That excessively simple view of the world, not surprisingly, turns out it couldn't be delivered. The bond markets revolt, the currency markets revolt, the stock markets revolt, Main Street starts revolting. So he's kind of blustering around at that point between either saying it's great success or perhaps that US children should have less dolls. I thought that was quite a remarkable statement.
Or fewer pencils, I think.
Fewer pence. All in all, yes, he needed a deal. And to give credit to the UK, I think that the UK has dealt with him relatively well. So he felt somehow safe in doing a deal with the UK. So yes, he needed it though. He needed it more than the UK needed it.
I think I'd agree with that. And what's interesting is that I remember maybe 3 months ago, we were having a conversation on the main podcast, and something was said along the lines of, by announcing all this stuff unilaterally, he's actually put himself in quite a weak position, not vis-a-vis the UK, but in general, he needed a deal. He needs a paradigm of a country that he holds up as playing ball and doing the right thing, as it were, to show to others that if you two behave in that way, you two can have beneficial things. And the more time went by, I think the more desperate the administration seems to have become for a deal with someone. Otherwise, it was just the whole world shunning him.
Well, I don't think he would admit it, and obviously you get the hype from the announcement, and Keir Starmer says the greatest ever, and he says it's the greatest ever. But I think under the surface, yes, I think that he needs a deal. I think books will be written about President Trump long after he ceases to be president, because on the face of it, he's this quite simple character, rabble rouser, able to tap into the public psyche. But he's also very needy. So he wants complete power, but he also wants people to love him. And if people don't love him, then he kind of doesn't quite know what to do with that. So he's quite a complex character. I can't pretend I'm studying him that closely. I try to avoid actually when he appears on screen. But so there's certainly some a lot to work with there. And I think the UK folk in DC have been doing exactly that.
Yeah, and it's also quite interesting that, having been in this country for many decades, after a while I became more tuned, let's say, to tone and fineries of language. And it's interesting to me that it looks as if there is a sort of tongue-in-cheek, almost overt manipulation going on when he's talking to Keir Starmer, when he's talking to Peter Mandelson. They're doing things very, very obviously to please him. And he doesn't seem to pick up on that. He seems to think it's all entirely genuine, which I find quite funny. I heard an argument yesterday, David, which I found exceptionally interesting. And it was that this puts the UK in quite a unique protective bubble. We know that Trump is mad and unreliable and mercurial and changes his mind from day to day. But having made this deal, this first deal, and sort of heralded it as this immensely great thing, it is more difficult for him to turn around now and shaft the UK in some very obvious way, for example, by putting new tariffs on some other industry that is very important to us. It does feel like we are now inside a very dysfunctional tent, but inside the tent nevertheless.
I hesitate to make predictions when it comes to President Trump. I hope that's the case, because I'm very much in the of the opinion that I'm quite happy with phase one, or some people are calling it even phase 0 of this deal, and I'd be quite happy if long grass grew around the future phases and nothing in fact ever happened with them. Now we've removed the initial burden, and if your argument holds, then if the UK did a go slow on what is supposed to come next, that would be fine. That may be the case. And certainly there are lots of other countries that President Trump now wants to turn his attention to. And the UK was never really in his sights as being the enemy.
Yeah.
But I just worry, I suppose, that something happens, and it could be something incredibly apparently trivial, like maybe Peter Mandelson and Keir Starmer know to say things to him that stroke his ego, but somehow he hears what you or I are saying, or anybody else, and suddenly takes offence at the UK.
Or a memo from the embassy leaks, to take an example from the first term, or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, that as well. And in that situation, I think that all bets are off. So again, when I talk about the fact that I think this deal is fine for the UK, I'm also slightly hesitant, because who knows if tomorrow he calls it all off. So I don't dismiss your argument at all. I simply try not to make too many predictions at all when it comes to President Trump, and just deal with him day by day. And incidentally, I rather think the UK government is also dealing with him day by day. I think behind all the words lie a government that knows full well that you can't really trust anything that he says, and they're just trying to ride the waves and do the best they can. And I think probably they're doing that okay.
Yeah, I think that goes without saying. All I'm saying is that we are today in a fractionally better position than we were last week, and in a fractionally better position than a country with which he hasn't, done this big fanfare. That's all. And that's all you can ever hope. And also, I guess on the diplomatic side, I'm also encouraged to think that the UK seems to be developing a language and a way of treating him that so far has worked. All I'm saying is it's better than the alternative, which is not to be doing those things.
Absolutely agree. I think we are in a better position than we were at the start of the week, and I hope that it lasts. What I will say as well about our US handling, one, I think the UK has a lot of people within the government system who are used to dealing with the US and have worked with this relationship for a long time and are quite good at it. And I would argue that actually the UK government system is better handling the US than it is the EU. Secondly, I think that this government is maybe finally getting the right people in the right places to do it and finally working out what it is that it needs to do. And I think that bringing together the right people with the experience of handling Washington is starting to pay some dividends. I think third as well, I think an old habit that's kicked in, I've been thinking quite a lot about the UK-US relationship. I think the UK, there's an institutional view in the UK government that it is best to hug the US tight because we think that that's the best way to roughly keep the US on the straight and narrow, even if it's a President Trump. And that might be working. And I might credit somebody who would probably put this far better than me, Jonathan Powell, who is in a senior position in government, who's a very shrewd operator.
Yeah, especially when it comes to handling the US,
yes,
actually.
He worked in DC. I suspect that some wise old heads are having their moment.
Yeah. On the detail of the deal, can we clarify the situation with beef? Because I have seen a lot of people posting with some certainty that the deal means we are now letting in hormone pumped beef from the USA, and that's not my reading of the terms. What is yours?
Technically, the UK continues to ban hormone-treated beef from the UK market. Some people are arguing that because we don't check very well at our border, then it might still get through, and that certainly could be an issue. But the ban holds, and not only that, it suggests from the text of the agreement that, in fact, the UK's right to ban US beef has been upheld and almost acknowledged by the US. So that's quite a remarkable turnaround from, frankly, previous documents where the US has said that this is a major barrier that they want to remove. So no, hormone-treated beef should not get into the UK, but as we know, some dodgy products can enter the country. So I'm not an expert on how things are checked, but
yeah, I mean, sure, horse got into the UK food chain a few years ago. Our systems for checking are our systems for checking, and they're our responsibility. But there's nothing in the deal that basically alters the food standards that we apply on anything coming into the country. I think that's clear.
If you've shopped online, chances are you've bought from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes it incredibly easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/promo. Go to shopify.com/promo.
Ladies, you'll end up shopping for your guy's deodorant, right? So try Degree's Original Cool Rush. You see, last year, Degree changed the formula, and men were mad. One guy even started a petition. So Degree admitted they messed up and brought the Original Cool Rush scent back. It's clean, crisp, and actually smells like someone you want to cuddle. And it's in Walmart, Target, and other stores now for under $4. So toss one in your cart and find out why it's the best-selling men's antiperspirant for the last decade. Degree Cool Rush is back, and it smells like victory.
Can you also clarify what on earth is going on with the Boeing thing? Because we heard Trump, first of all, in his sort of impromptu presser after the deal say that, then there's an agreement also to buy loads of stuff from Boeing. It's not in the deal as far as I can see. It was repeated by the White House press secretary. So do we know what's going on there?
This is known in the parlance as doing a Juncker, which is to the government to make promises that it can't actually deliver, but which other people might be delivering, because that's after the former European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, who did that with Trump first time round. It does appear that British Airways have just put in an order for more Boeing planes. That probably isn't their value. Maybe that's the book value, but President Trump has hyped this up as part of the deal, and I'm sure the UK government are only too happy for President Trump to suggest that that's part of the deal. It's an entirely separate commercial transaction, but there is a transaction. British Airways regularly buys Boeing planes, so it shouldn't come out of the ordinary, but hey, if it makes President Trump happy, who are we to complain?
What do you think of the sequencing that we're seeing now? India, and I have to say, one of the remarkable things has been how closely kept these secrets have been until really everyone is ready to announce them. It certainly wasn't the case with recent administrations before this one, that, everything was kept completely secret until the day before, when the government fed a few newspapers some lines. So what do you think of the sequencing? India, then US, then EU. Does that have advantages? Does it have disadvantages? Is there a danger there, or does that improve the chances of the big one that's coming up next week, basically?
So I don't think the sequence affects what will happen with the EU. And the reason why is that actually much of what's being discussed with the EU, although it's only now being fed to the media, was actually broadly agreed during February and March. And much of this is now domestic media handling. What I think is happening is that the UK government is getting better at thinking about trade, but unfortunately not quickly enough with regard to the EU, where there's been a missed opportunity, and it will have to come back to this. So by this I mean trade deals have been overhyped wildly in the UK. They aren't, in fact, economically transformational. Perhaps once they were, but nowadays, when we have globalization in full flow, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference when you get a new trade deal. It's incremental, it's an improvement, but it doesn't change huge amounts. And so I think this government has finally realised...
Because we have relatively low tariffs with everyone anyway. Like, that's the norm nowadays.
Exactly. Global trade is happening anyway. We have relatively low tariffs. We're a services economy. Much of that happens independently of government. What I think has happened is that the UK government and some key individuals within it have come to realise this about trade deals. And rather than aiming for perfection, they've realised, let's just make some incremental improvements. And I think that that's a sensible way to go. And as it happened, that allowed...
I mean, it's what you and I have been praying for about a decade, right?
Indeed. One could suggest that perhaps we're starting to have some influence.
Like, bank the small wins and keep going.
Yes, we might be having some influence, perhaps. Now, the slight disadvantage with all of this, India had been in the works for 3 years, and there was roughly a deal on the table. The US had been in the works for about 10 minutes, as I mentioned, and what Trump came up with was actually perfectly reasonable for us to accept. With the EU, much of this actually was shaped in the last 6 months of last year after Labour came into power, and they were so nervous they didn't really say anything. So all of the things that Keir Starmer is now saying, and Nick Thomas-Symonds is now saying, that the EU is now the priority, is almost trying to act as if they're trying to shape the summit next week. It's a little bit late for that. The EU was looking for those kind of warm words last year to make something more ambitious. So we're going to have another fairly limited deal with the EU, which is going to be roughly an agreement to enter into detailed talks on a few areas like food and drink and energy. Better than nothing, better than where we could have expected under the previous government. Not, however, yet groundbreaking. But possibly a government that is starting to get into its stride. So perhaps a little bit of hope with regard to the EU that it will carry on and try to and try to get the mood music better. And it certainly will have reassured, I think, people in Brussels that the UK stood up so firmly against US food standards. That is a big red line for the EU with regard to UK relations. And the UK clearly preferring Brussels' approach to the DC approach is a big tick in the box for the EU reset.
And also a lot of the big tech stuff that the EU, I was hearing from my contacts at the Commission, was very worried about. None of that was in this limited agreement with Trump.
That's right. Although I think there's still some chance it will be in the future. So I wouldn't say there are no worries in Brussels about a few of these things, but the main ones have been crossed off. The slight issue there, though, is that the Commission goes into full head down, win a trade deal mode against a UK that's still not that good at negotiating. Unfortunately, the Commission can still rather roll over the UK. So there are still likely to be some lingering problems. But as I say, I detect some improvement in the UK approach. As you say, they're starting to do what you and I and others had suggested, but I think there's some way to go.
It's interesting. I was speaking to a contact in Brussels yesterday, and they were saying that actually, because as you know, I'm sure, there are two schools of thought in Brussels as well. There is the school of thought that says nothing has changed, the Theresa May mantra, we have the same principles and rules that we've always had, cherry picking, all of that. But there is a growing school of thought that says Trump is a big change to the situation, not just because of him personally, but because it kind of proves there is a need to diversify relationships, that you can't really rely on any one partner at any given time, etc., and that the EU should be more ambitious about creating different tiers of participation in the single market, should be more creative in its approach to the customs union and things like that. And I think what this deal does is it does encourage the EU, for instance, on tech, if there are areas that it is worried about, well, a formal conversation between the UK and the US is not now just a theoretical prospect. It is something that is happening and has a structure. And as you said, it can be kicked in the long grass very easily, diplomatically, or it can be sped up. And I think it does create a situation where the EU now has to decide whether it wants to bring the UK in on certain areas, on certain rules, on certain dynamic alignment. Do you think it has that effect?
There is a lively debate, I would say, among folk within and around the Commission on this question. And this is where actually social media gets quite frustrating, because there's lots of sort of EU purists on social media when it comes to the UK relationship saying, forget it, forget everything, you're all dreamers, you're all asking too much. Well, in fact, in Brussels, there are definitely those who think in the way you just described, that there is an opportunity to do more. But there is also the institutional approach to doing trade. And obviously, institutional inertia is really strong in large bureaucracies. And that treats everything as a negotiation to be won for the members, rather than perhaps thinking about more of a strategic partnership. But I've had that conversation with a few people around Brussels. They are having that conversation. Some of them even admit the EU is perhaps not as good at sort of envisioning a future relationship with any country, and particularly with neighbours, as perhaps it should be. But I'm not quite sure where that change would come from. So at the moment, there's a lot of talk in Brussels of change, but perhaps not quite the sign of it happening. So maybe it's a case for the UK of being patient and also putting forward some more vision, because until really the last week or two, the UK hadn't put this forward either. So there's a dance to be done together, I think.
Yeah. Final question, David. I know you hate talking about the politics around trade deals, because you see yourself very much as a straight down the line trade person. But you have experienced the politics around trade deals, especially with the EU, for many, many years now, and you have a good radar about it. Does a deal with India and a deal with the United States, forget how big they are, how comprehensive they are, how good they are, how bad they are? I'm talking just as headlines splashed on the front of the Telegraph or the Express. Does that actually give the UK government a little bit more political space now to be more ambitious with the EU? Because they can say, no, we're not, this is not about rejoining via the back door. You can see that our ambitions are global. You can see that we are succeeding in bringing in the benefits of Brexit that the previous government could not bring. And therefore, you need to give us a little bit of slack in trying to craft something that's a bit better with the EU. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, much though I don't go into the pure politics so much, I do think that trade always requires good communication, and you haven't really had that around trade for some time from a UK government. And even in the last week, around these India and US deals, you still haven't had very good communication from the UK government. They're still in kind of slightly overhyping mode. They're not really making the case that you just made, and indeed the case you made before about incremental progress. I think there is a case to be made for the kind of Keir Starmer steady approach to doing trade that says you can trust now that I'm making all the progress I can with all of the different trade partners that we have. And I think there is a lot of space to do more with the EU, and to show that you can do that while still trading more with the US and India. But I think that needs a lot better of an approach to communication from the government.
Yes, I agree. I said that was a final question, but actually something just occurred to me. What do you think of the opposition's reaction? Because the reaction to the India deal was largely, I think, dictated by quite mischievous media zeroing in on something that they could spin very negatively from a right-wing point of view, and the opposition just going with it. And now, as a matter of fact, that's beginning to fall apart, because it turns out that it was Kemi Badenoch herself that had negotiated the reciprocal national insurance exemption, albeit for 2 years. But it's difficult to argue that extending it to 3 years is the deal breaker. But I was really quite surprised by her reaction to the US-UK announcement. It seemed to me really quite unconservative, especially from a former Secretary of Trade that went around touting memorandums of understanding with Alabama as the best thing since sliced bread, and that will open GDP of X gazillion to the UK. It seemed like quite a sour and politically naive reaction.
What I note is that plenty of people on the right, some in the Conservative Party, some in Reform, have actually welcomed both the India and the US trade deals. Strange though it is to find myself in the same place apparently as Dan Hannan. I apparently do.
And Steve Baker. But, and to an extent Nigel Farage.
That being said, no, I think that Kemi Badenoch's response has been over hasty and just all in the wrong places. She could have said, with regard to the India deal, I thought this wasn't ambitious enough and the government didn't get enough, but that's not quite what she said. And with regard to the US, it just looked bizarre to say, well, we've been rolled over, when quite obviously that wasn't the case. Basically, her responses just aren't ringing true to what the case might be. So there could have been good responses. She didn't come up with them, and I think that, to be honest, that's been noted across the political spectrum, is that she's hardly been a player in this at all. Everyone is ignoring what she said about these deals.
Yes, if they don't want to do trade with India, and they don't want to do trade with China, and they don't want to do trade with the US, and they don't want to do trade with the EU, who the hell do they want to do trade with? It does open them up, I think, to that accusation. David, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you, and you've helped me clarify a lot of stuff, both on the detail and in my head, and for that I thank you.
Thank you.
Quiet Riot.
A lot of that was surprising to me in that I had seen so many people stating so many things with so much confidence, most of which turned out to be nonsense. When I actually read the document, I thought I must be hallucinating. I felt I must be missing something. But no, turns out a lot of people just got the wrong end of the stick on this. If you get good value from this podcast, support this podcast on Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. Thank you for listening. Speak on Thursday.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith and Andreou. Produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simona Canelu. And edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global. Quiet Riot.